and I should say that she is the one who kind of done a lot of work on gender budgeting, which is a very, very key word of, which was used to from 2004, right? I mean, that has been came as a very institutionalized mechanism for gender budgeting at that time. And she's also affiliated to Levy Institute. Maybe a number of institute as visiting professors across the world. And she has also published a number of books on fiscal policy and sustainable development, on gender budgeting, and also on the decentralized economy and its relation with the social sector, etc. I know that she has been involved with various governments across the world in terms of their public policies, frameworks, developing fiscal policies and discussions regarding that. So whenever I see that she has been traveling across the world, participating in different discussions and conferences. So it's actually a privilege for us to have her here to talk to our students. And today she will be broadly talking about global economic uncertainties and India. So I think I welcome Lekha Chichi. I call her Lekha Chichi to this. Let's hear her. And I hope Lekha Chichi can talk about around 45 minutes. Then the students can actually have some interaction for 15 minutes. Okay. That'll be good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hari. Thank you so much for having me. We had plans to come over to the campus, but it's a late night program.
We'll do that later.
We will do that later, because driving back home, that from Ponmudi to home was like, so that was the reason why I didn't come over, but we can do it later. As Hari mentioned, the topic of our conversation today is global economic uncertainties and India, the context of India. So this topic, had Hari been asking me to speak to you a few years back, I would have started my argument based on low interest regime and the fiscal policy. But now things are not like that. The nations, they are no longer into that low interest rate regime. You know that in US, their center bank, the Fed Reserve, they are in hawkish mode. So they are increasing the interest rates. So the rest of the world, they have to increase the interest rates, but it's a kind of instigating a global recession as one center bank is going hawkish. Because if you don't increase the interest rates, if the emerging economies don't increase the interest rate, then, our capital will be flighty. Because it's a hot money. Hot money always responds to the, interest rate differentials, and they go to the country where interest rate is high. So it is challenging. So we need to look into the question of public policy from that perspective of, that increased interest rates or that hawkish interest rate mode. This is the first point I want to pitch. Hope that central bank stance is clear for you. Now let's get into the fiscal policy. In the global economic crisis, how do you want, if you are the finance minister, because this is a time which is, it's very tough for the finance ministers to take a call on any kind of policies, because monetary policy is partial in its impact or effectiveness on the growth outcomes, and they have a heavy lifting to do to prevent a global recession. Now, what they can do, they need to look into the public debt management. They have to manage their fiscal deficits. Deficits, you can understand, right? His revenue and expenditure, if there is any gap, he needs to borrow. So he needs to look into the fiscal deficit. So how the finance ministers will pitch when the central bank chief or the central bank or the monetary policy is in a hawkish mode. So that's a situation. Now, to add to it, we need to have fiscal space to enable the climate-related commitments. Because in COP29, that's going to happen in 28, that's going to happen in Dubai late this year, late November or the early December. So we have commitments to take our nations to the net zero Okay, emissions. So, what is that climate change commitments need to be incorporated into the government functions or the budgetary allocations? So, when we calculate all these risk and macroeconomic uncertainties that's emanating from this poly crisis, which is happening right now, it's going to be huge for the developed world. I think the estimates, I think Geeta Gopinath in Marrakesh in the economic forum, she announced that it is going to be around 7% of GDP for the emerging economies and around 5% of GDP, this burden, this fiscal space for the, developed countries, 5 and 7. So, this is the context in which we need to look into the poly crisis. Poly crisis in the sense, of course, the uncertainties that is emanating from war. We need to look into that. Then, as I mentioned earlier, the climate change crisis. Now, the energy crisis, because we know that our current account deficit is widening. We have external shocks or exogenous shocks that's coming from the oil price fluctuations, energy shocks. So, it's a poly crisis. Poly crisis in the sense, it's a multiple crisis. And this term, it was not exactly coined by Adam Tooze, but he has effectively argued about this poly crisis, that it is not, given. We need to, work towards the public policy space to tackle the this poly crisis. And recently, I attended a program in Overseas Development Institute in London, where this poly crisis, debt restructuring, and the fiscal space was articulated. My former boss, Ratin Roy, you know him. He was the member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He was the director of NIPFP for 7 years. So he invited me, and that was quite a good exposure for me to understand the poly crisis and how the fiscal policies are getting recalibrated to address these issues. Now, you have to visualize yourself as finance minister or central bank chief. And how do you want to address this poly crisis? I mentioned about the current account deficit, which is widening. Excuse me. So current account deficit in the sense, exports minus imports. So your import bill is increasing because you have to finance your exogenous shocks in the form of heightening this oil prices. You have supply chain disruptions that's emanating from the post-war or the war regime. So a lot of issues, and it's also a post-pandemic fiscal space or a post-pandemic fiscal strategy which we need to recalibrate. So in this fiscal space, what you have to think is which is very important, is to go beyond the GDP paradigm. It is not like, you need to have an economic recovery, which is of course very important, but you cannot stop at that level. You have to, go ahead from the GDP paradigm. So in this poly crisis, when there is war, when there is climate crisis, when there is energy crisis, so how do you want to pitch your fiscal policy space? Now, when there is widening current account deficit, if the central bank, governor now deciding that we are going towards a low interest rate regime, that can affect the capital, the foreign capital formation. In the sense, if the interest rate differential is huge, the money will respond to the countries where the interest rate is high. And as I mentioned earlier, the Western world is keeping the interest rate not lower. It's mounting. So unless we keep the interest rates high, then there will be the interest rate differentials and there will be capital flight, because the money will go to the country in which there is high interest rates. So that is the hot money. Hot money always respond to the countries where interest rates are high. So we can't do anything related to the interest rate in India because we are keeping it at 6.5. Of course, central bank governor has articulated that he is taking a pause, but that is not the peak rate, but he is taking a pause. So that's a way the central bank governor articulated about the interest rates. Now, it has got its own implications on the fiscal policy front. In the sense, the public debt management is going costlier. So if you look into the fiscal risk, if you look into the debt servicing burden, that is, that can be captured into the interest rates, interest payments as a percentage of the revenue receipts. Like the total revenue you earn, what is the percentage of that which is going towards debt servicing? That is your interest payments. So if that ratio is quite huge, then you are crowding out within the expenditure, with the revenue expenditure. If a huge chunk is going for the debt servicing, you're crowding out that interest payments and the other expenditure within the revenue expenditure front. You're just doing a crowding out. So what to do regarding controlling this debt servicing burden, especially when the interest rate is mounting? So now, within this limited resources, what you can articulate or what you can do within this limited fiscal space, you have a question that you will invest on capital formation, human capital formation, or you will invest your money in the infrastructure investment. So there is a kind of a consensus that when the interest rate is going higher, when the public debt management is getting costlier, within the limited fiscal space, you just invest that on infrastructure, public infrastructure, so that it will crowd in private investment. So that's a way. Now, there is a huge pressure for the countries to perform, to reduce the fiscal risk and to perform in terms of fiscal rules. In the sense, we have to articulate that our country's fiscal deficit is not more than 3% of GDP, because the credit rating agencies are on watch, and that it's very crucial, because the private investment otherwise will suffer, because the investors will not come to our country if the macroeconomic fundamentals are not strong. So it's a kind of vicious circle. Like on one side, interest rate is mounting. On other side, fiscal policy needs to be kept accommodative, in the sense that if it is not kept accommodative, it will affect the overall growth recovery process, because the growth recovery is mainly now from the fiscal space or the fiscal point of view, not from the monetary point of view, because they are going hawkish to control three things. One is the capital flight. The second is they have to control the global inflation, mounting inflation. Otherwise, you get into the negative interest rate regime. And what exactly is a negative interest rate regime? You have nominal rate and inflationary expectations or inflation, and real interest rate is nominal interest rate minus inflation. So if the real interest rate is negative, that is, inflation is above the nominal interest rate, then your real interest rate will be negative. Then you are getting into negative interest rate quadrant. Then what will happen? You just imagine your savings. You will not get what you have put into the bank, right? If the interest rates are negative. So that's a big issue. Then our central bank governor articulated that he's going on a hawkish mode. His main concern was to tackle this negative interest rates, and he articulated in the press conference that he's worried about the negative interest rate, and the interest this anchor of the repo rate is 4% and not 6%, and he made it explicit, because he wanted to tackle the negative interest rates. And what is this nominal anchor? In India, when we look into the monetary policy framework, every country needs to articulate an inflation anchor, that inflation need not cross a particular anchor. And in our country, we visualized it as 4%. In US, it is 2%. So in different countries, that nominal anchor for inflation is 4%. So after 4%, officially, we can tolerate inflation. But again, we articulated on a band. Band in the sense, plus or minus 2. Like up to 6%, it's okay to have inflation. And after that, we are out of the comfort zone. But now, Shaktikant Das has articulated that we need to take that narrative back to 4%. Otherwise, we will get into the negative interest rate regime. So that's challenging. Like on one side, you just visualize yourself as the RBI governor. On one side, your challenges are related to mounting inflation, financialization of savings. Otherwise, you get into the negative interest rate regime. your capital is getting flighty. So when these things happen, you need to keep the interest rate higher. But what is the repercussion on the other side? That public debt management is getting costlier. Okay, because the interest payments, when the interest rate go higher, your debt servicing is getting costlier. Now, if you look into the economic growth recovery process, that's also getting affected, because for the economic growth recovery process, you need to keep the interest rates at a lower rate so that you can do investment at a very comfortable rate of interest, because of interest rates and investment, there's an inverse relationship. So interest rate needs to be lower for investment to pick up. So it is affecting the growth recovery process. So you are in a dilemma, and you can talk to me when I open the flow that had you been the chief of the central bank, then what decision you would have taken? If you go on a hawkish mode by keeping the interest rate higher, or you will consider a pause or a decrease in the interest rate so that the growth recovery process can happen. So these are the challenges, when I talk about the central bank. Now, I talk about, this fiscal policy challenges, in the sense we need to keep that fiscal policy accommodative, provided, this monetary policy is going hawkish. So we need to keep the fiscal policy accommodative. Then what will happen? Like your debt will mount, your deficit will mount. So beyond a point, you can't do that, because you have a deficit threshold in your country that is 3% of GDP. So finance minister's job is also very tough against this backdrop of poly crisis. So now the articulation is that we can't even think of a strict 3% fiscal deficit to GDP, coming back to that original fiscal rule, because if we do that, we need to do an expenditure compression. So as finance minister, you visualize, will you go for an expenditure reduction this moment? If you do that, it will affect the human capital formation in your country, and it affect the physical infrastructure, because then you need to articulate that I'm keeping my fiscal policy accommodative by linking it to the capex formation, because that is going to revive your economic growth, because the investment and the growth, there is a link to it. So that's a way, Nirmala Sitharaman, that's a way the subnational governments, they are articulating. Okay, so let's go ahead. So that's the way it happened. Like, we need to keep the fiscal policy accommodative so that, it will support the growth recovery process. Now, let's unpack this concern. You need to keep the fiscal policy accommodative by keeping the deficit at 3%, but then this fiscal consolidation path you need to check. In the sense, this 3% can be attained through tax buoyancy path and revenue expenditure compression path. So which path you follow, that finance minister needs to take a call. And if you're taking a path like, if we are going to collect the revenue, we do a revenue mobilization, and through the tax buoyancy path, we are going to attain that 3% of GDP, the fiscal deficit. I don't have any quarrel with that. But in the post-pandemic era, in the time of poly crisis, the revenues are uncertain. So when the revenues are uncertain, to reach this, that 3% of GDP can happen only if you control your expenditure. But expenditure cut, that has humanitarian crisis, that can lead to humanitarian crisis, especially in the post-pandemic period, that can also lead to, slowing down of the economic growth recovery process. So what you do? You need to maintain it at 3%, then you have to improve your revenue. Now, we invented something else. We asked the state governments, the subnational governments, that go ahead to 3.5% of GDP, your fiscal deficit. But only one thing you need to do right now is that extra borrowing space, that 0.5, you just link it to structural reforms. Because in the post-pandemic or in the poly-crisis period, structural reforms are very crucial. So you link that extra 0.5 to the structural reforms, then you will be fine. And that structural reforms is linked to the power sector reforms. Like if a state undergo power sector reforms, and if they come into that financial efficiency parameters, then the state can have that 0.5 extra borrowing space. Now, how many states are willing to do this? Or how many states are performing, like controlling this financial and operational efficiency parameters related to this structural or the sector, which is the power sector? If you look into that, the data is available in the Ministry of Power website. You can take a look into the dashboard. On the financial parameters, the efficiency is measured in terms of the tariff revisions, reducing the aggregate technical and commercial loss, reducing the gap between the cost and the revenue, so that they are not getting into the negative quadrant. So these are the financial efficiency parameters related to the power sector. On the operational efficiency parameters, you have to get into the power infrastructure. What are the important power infrastructure reforms you need to undertake in the state? And you get a state-wise comparison that how the states are performing in terms of the efficiency parameters in the power sector. But this articulation of linking the fiscal rules to the structural reforms, or the fiscal consolidation to the structural reforms.
Sorry, Lekha,
yeah.
I think there is a hand raised by Niharika. Niharika? Audio is going.
Oh, the clarity has gone. Okay.
Yeah,
is it better right now?
Maybe when you go away from the phone, then probably it's kind of...
Okay. Is it better, Niharika? Is it better?
No, it's the same.
It's the same. Okay.
Arjun also raised it. I mean, sometimes we feel it's a kind of... Some terms are also kind of, they have to really closely watch it to understand the terms. But they are not able to hear that, I think.
Okay.
We manage it.
Okay.
Maybe you can go a little slow. Let's see how this is working.
Okay.
Can you go a little slow?
Slower. Okay. So I was talking about the structural reforms related to the power sector. Now it's clear, Niharika and Arjun? No? My voice is not clear right now?
Nagaja, tell me.
I think it's the same.
Is it clear now?
Hello, sir.
Arjun, tell me, is it clear?
Sir,
It's clear.
and this earpods that might increase the quality of the voice that is coming.
Amit,
Okay. So, is it okay right now?
yeah, this is better, I think.
Better. Okay. This is better. Okay. Let's do it then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I was talking about the economic growth of a country. It has got two important components. One is that structural component, and the other is the cyclical component. So, structural in the sense, if you look at the GDP, it has got a trend component and the cyclicality. So, when you get into the monetary and fiscal policy mode to correct the cyclicality, that is a short term in nature, then you are not correcting the process completely. You need to look into the structural reforms. That's why I mentioned about the power sector, because the power sector reforms are related to the structural reforms. You can take a look into the paper by Geeta Gopinath. She explained that the cycle is trend. Like in the sense, you studied about business cycles in the class. Like the economy has got business cycles. So I mentioned about the policies by the government, and the policies by the central bank, they act as a counter-cyclical policy tool. Like, when the economy is in recession, counter-cyclical means you keep your interest rate lower, or you pump prime. More expenditure is, you do the pump priming so that the economy will grow fast. But when the economy is in an upturn, then you can think about raising the interest rate and just take back that pump priming you have done. Little bit of an expenditure constraint or restraint. So that's a way this counter-cyclical policy that works. But this counter-cyclical policy tool, in the time of post-pandemic, after the crisis, it was not working quite well, because in the context of the emerging countries like India, this believing that there is a business cycle itself is problematic, because after the crisis, the economy has come down. It is a permanent scar rather than a temporary, downturn. If it's a temporary thing, then the moment the fiscal and monetary policies do a triggering, it will go back to the original pre-pandemic, era or pre-pandemic growth path. But that's not happening. The reason is that we need to look into this question as permanent scar. It's a permanent downturn. Then the structural issues are very important, and the governments they have started articulating about the structural reforms. That's why you have to do this 2 + 2 4 right now. That's why I mentioned earlier that the fiscal consolidation is very closely correlated to this structural reforms, that is focusing that extra 0.5% on the power sector. Now we need to plug in the new areas of concern, which I mentioned in the first part of the lecture. Those new areas of concern are climate change crisis, that related risk and uncertainties. Now again, there is a tug of war between the monetary policy and the fiscal policy authorities. Like, I'm again asking the question, think a moment that you are the central bank chief. I'm asking you to take care of the climate change related risk and uncertainties. How do you do that? Climate change risk and uncertainties is a political economy question. So then, getting into political economy question means you are getting into the reputation risk. Like, you don't have any enough tools with the central bank to tackle this climate change related risk and uncertainties. So then you put the ball into the fiscal policy realm. So the fiscal policy makers, they announced that, okay, we will do a climate responsive budgeting. We will do ecological fiscal transfer by transferring the money to the subnational governments so that they can tackle the energy crisis or the climate change related risk and uncertainties. So that's the way it is happening right now. The monetary policy is little shy to take it up, the climate change related issues. Now, if you ask me that not even a single country, from the monetary policy front got into this climate change related crisis, then my answer is, of course, there are countries like the ECB, the European Central Bank, chief, the Christine Lagarde. He was the IMF managing director. She's quite committed to the climate change related risk and uncertainties and to articulate within the monetary policy front. In the sense, the greening of monetary policy, that was given huge emphasis in the policies related to this monetary policy stance within the ECB, the European Central Bank. And if you look into the Bank of England, they are also quite vocal about the climate change concerns. But RBI, are we ready to get into this question? All what I understood is, within this liquidity guidance, within that, the RBI has a statutory liquidity ratio. The banks, the commercial banks, they have to keep a certain portion of their assets with the central bank as per this statutory liquidity ratio. That's the way they have done. After that, they can lend money, the credit they can do, and then there is a priority sector lending which is 40%. And RBI, what they have done within this priority sector lending, a portion was tied to the green infrastructure project. So that's a way that greening of monetary policy in a limited scale we have undertaken. how the climate change concerns were addressed by the fiscal policy authorities within the financing pattern of deficit, because we do predominantly the monetary, not the monetary financing, the bond financing. So within the bond financing, a portion of that financing of deficit is made thematic, and it is linked to the climate bonds or the climate financing. So we have climate bonds right now, and 2 years back this was announced by Nirmala Sitharaman in her budget in speech. So we have climate bonds. It's a kind of a thematic bond. So these are the ways in which we address the climate change concerns, like the way we did the greening of monetary policy by incorporating that green element into the priority sector lending. We have done ecological fiscal transfers in the sense that the money devolved from the center to the states, that IGFT, intergovernmental fiscal transfers, that's based on a scientific formula. So we incorporated one criteria related to the climate change, that is a forest cover, and devolve the funds down. We call it as ecological fiscal transfers. Now we also articulated within the financing pattern of deficit, we are incorporating the climate bonds. So these are the different ways in which we have incorporated the climate change related concerns like risk and uncertainties. Now, what we have to do is we have to make things transparent, like how much a country is spending on climate change. If I am asked, I should have a statement if I am the finance minister. So the scholars have started looking into the budget documents. We have a lot of demand for grants for each sectors. So we need to apply a lens, that green lens, and need to ask a question, how much the country is spending on adaptation, mitigation, loss and damages. So then we come up with a number. And IPFP, where I work, before this COP27 in Egypt, we were asked to do that exercise, because that time, 1 year back, that was the first time we put forward national adaptation communication. So then it was very important to look into the question how much a country is spending on the climate change related risk and uncertainties. So we came up with around a number like 5% of GDP. So based on that, it is projected like in future how much the country required to spend on the climate change related commitments. So that transparency is very important for an accountability process. So these are the ways in which we get into these new issues. Then another new issue is we are going digital. Is it good or bad? We have a lot of artificial intelligence and related, changes happening in the world. So are we ready? Whether that will widen the inequality, whether that will do a replacement in the labor markets. So these are the questions, and there are concerns. Like when we think about the labor market, of course, on one side, the fastest and smartest way to develop your GDP is to get the labor force, the army of force, which is untapped in the economy, by running the employer of last resort policies. But after a point of time, when there is automation and when there is this artificial intelligence getting, importance, when the technological revolution happen, then whether that's replacing the labor, of course it will affect certain sectors. Of course it will widen the inequalities between the developed world and the developing world, just because the infrastructure constraints are there. So are we ready? Our infrastructure is not ready. So these are the concerns, and it will create some sort of repercussions, especially in the emerging economies. And we need to, because we can't say no to AI, but we need to get ready to skill. That skilling is required to face these new challenges. Now, going digital also includes in this crypto. In the era of the money and finance transformation. Now there are a lot of transformations or a lot of innovations that happened in the area of money and finance. We know that over the years. But now the crypto, it's a high risk and high return asset. And I know some of you have already started investing in crypto. And I have met many Turkish students and the students from the Christ University, Lavasa. They started investing in crypto. But the question is, what is the regulatory mechanism? In the G20 meetings, we articulated that the major global issues are going to be debt restructuring, regulations of crypto, climate crisis, energy crisis. So these are the questions like we are talking when it comes to the multilateral, that economic diplomacy, from that point of view, we start articulating about these issues. So when I talk about the global economic headwinds or the global economic challenges, that includes, of course, the war, it includes energy crisis, it includes the climate change related crisis, and also this digital. We are going to, it's not exactly a cashless economy or anything, but we are going a little into the uncharted realms like crypto, the CBDCs, the central bank digital currency. So these are the challenges which we need to look into. So polycrisis means it is not equal to climate crisis alone. It is a complex crisis, and the fiscal and monetary policy authorities need to look into by keeping the policy accommodative, because we can't get into a neutral stance right now, because it will affect the economic growth recovery process, especially in a post-pandemic and the crisis-filled, polycrisis-filled world. And I stop here because we need to have some questions.
And I should say that she is the one who kind of done a lot of work on gender budgeting, which is a very, very key word of, which was used to, from 2004, right? I mean, that has been came as a very institutionalized mechanism for gender budgeting at that time. Yeah. And she's also affiliated to Levy Institute. Maybe a number of institute as visiting professors across the world. And she has also published a number of books on fiscal policy and sustainable development, on gender budgeting, and also on the decentralized economy and its relation with the social sector, etc. I know that she has been involved with various governments across the world in terms of their public policies, frameworks, developing fiscal policies and discussions regarding that. So whenever I see that she has been traveling across the world, participating in different discussions and conferences. So it's actually a privilege for us to have her here to talk to our students. And today she will be broadly talking about global economic uncertainties and India. So I think I welcome Lekha Chichi. I call her Lekha Chichi to this. Let's hear her. And I hope Lekha Chichi can talk about around 45 minutes.